This is how my great-great-grandfather arrived in India. It's 4 a.m. on the morning of August the 9th, 1821, and the ship on which the 20-year-old James Hills was travelling had struck a reef off Setiavaram. The ship was the Lady Lushington, a 472-ton bark that had been laid down at Blackwall in 1807. They had been battling a fierce storm up through the Bay of Bengal, and the exhausted captain, Andrew Scott, who was also James Hills's uncle, had handed over the helm to his first mate and gone below to catch a brief rest. As the ship sank, Captain Scott lashed his nephew to a hen coop, threw him over the side, and said, "Take your chance with God, my lad." This is all fact, as attested by Captain Scott, who also survived, and he wrote in his report to the subsequent Board of Inquiry. Now, the family myth on which I was brought up went on to say that young James, near the point of death, with no possessions apart from his waterlogged clothes, was rescued from the surf by an Italian doctor by the name of John Angelo Savi. He was then nursed back to health by Dr. Savi's wife, who had been a Miss Elizabeth Corderon, whose father was General Corderon, who had led the French troops against Clive at Plassey. Young James Hills was then nursed back to health by the wife and his 3 daughters, and when he recovered, he made his way to Calcutta, got a job as a clerk in a firm of indigo brokers, and made a quick fortune. A few years later, he returned to the Savi family and wooed and wed the youngest and most beautiful of the Savi daughters, the 17-year-old Charlotte Antoinette Savi. Again, the last sentence is absolutely true. James Hills and the ravishing Charlotte Savi were married in Calcutta on the 6th of June 1831. But the reality of what had actually happened to James Hills in the 10 years between his very wet and traumatic arrival in India and his wedding is probably, I'm afraid, slightly less romantic. The Savi family were well-established indigo planters in East Bengal, and somehow James Hills had indeed got a job with an indigo broker, quickly learned the trade, and made sufficient money to be accepted as a son-in-law by John Angelo Savi. And, helped no doubt by this family connection, James Hills and his young bride set off to establish himself as an indigo planter at Neechindapur in what is now Bangladesh, and about 65 miles northeast of Calcutta. And now this map, you won't see much on it, but let me just point out that here we have Kishnagar, and here is Neechindapur, and that is one of the many rivers flowing through the region. And this line here actually represents the East India Railway. It wasn't built until the 1860s. So the time we're talking about when they went there, I would imagine it would have taken 2 to 3 days to get from Calcutta up to Neechindapur by a mixture of rivercraft and bullock carts and so on. Once the railway was built, and it was one of Isambard Kingdom Brunel's last projects. Don't you remember that? And that would have made the trip only to took a few hours. Now, my story so far raises 2 questions. How was it possible to make a quick fortune from lumps of blue dye? And why had James Hills gone out to India in the first place? To answer the second question, we need to go back a few years to the border country, that wild and lawless area of moorland that lies between England and Scotland. This was Reiver country, the several large families, the Buccleuchs, the Scotts, the Kerrs and the Innises, murdering each other and stealing one another's cattle. Blood feuds raged. But, like the Montagues and the Capulets in Romeo and Juliet, just occasionally the younger generation met and fell in love. In 1769, Margaret Kerr, the sister of Walter Kerr, who later ruined himself in a 12-year legal battle to establish his claim to the dukedom of Roxburgh, Margaret Kerr had a secret affair with, and possibly even a clandestine marriage, to the young heir to the Buccleuchs. He then went off to the wars and was killed, leaving behind a devastated and pregnant Margaret Kerr. Now the Hilleses, although not in the same social league, were prosperous, well-respected tenant farmers, and James Hills's grandfather, also called James Hills, was persuaded, bribed, with the connivance of the Dowager Duchess of Buccleuch, to marry the beautiful Miss Kerr. A few months later, the first of their 6 children was born and christened Archibald Hills, who in turn grew up and married Elizabeth Scott of Ancram, and our James Hills was their eldest son, born on the 15th of June, 1801. That is, that's the family, and that is James Hills there. He was the eldest of this large border family. Now, by 1821, 2 things had happened. Firstly, Archibald Hills had taken to the bottle and was in danger of losing his tenancy, and secondly, the locals could not avoid noticing that young James Hills looked exactly like a Buccleuch. So, it was decided that he must leave the country and seek his fortune, and the chosen method for him to do this was to head for India as a passenger on his uncle's ship, the unlucky Lady Lushington. So now we turn our attention to the second question, and look into the story of that mysterious substance called indigo, a potent blue dye which over the centuries had acquired a mystical, almost magical mythology. And here is a salesman's sample box of various grades and types of indigo. Indigo is a plant extract, and various species are found across the world. The Northern European version, Isatis tinctoria, is commonly known as woad. And this is the material that ancient tribes used to paint on their skin to frighten their enemies. It is, however, a poor, pale thing compared to the version that grows in warmer climates, Indigo fera tinctoria, which was first discovered growing wild in India before traders took it to North Africa and then on to the Caribbean, the Americas, while the Dutch took it to Southeast Asia. But it was in the wet plains of East Bengal that it rarely thrived. The plant is a perennial shrub that looks rather like very large spinach, yielding its best quality leaves in the 2nd and 3rd years. Indigo, with its intense, rich blue colour, is unique among natural dyes for being totally fast, resistant to fading, and clinging tenaciously to any fibre base into which it is soaked. It is impossible to wash out, and works equally well on wool, flax, or cotton. It is very noticeable if you look at old tapestries that it's the blue colour which has always survived the best. Growing indigo was one thing, extracting the dye was quite another, And a weird, complicated process it was, combining delicate technical skills with great manual effort. Now this slide actually goes back some time, and it comes from the West Indies, I think, and they are actually using the woad plant, but it shows diagrammatically, shows the process very easily. First of all, you have the leaves crushed, preferably, put into one tank, then they're moved into another one, and then that's the fermentation tank, and then it's moved into the oxidation tank before the sediment is filtered off and pressed into these cakes. So first the leaves were bruised in a mill, then loaded into tanks of water where they were allowed to ferment until a greenish foam was produced. And the timing of the next stage, transferring the liquor into the oxidizing tank, is absolutely critical. This is a real skill. And then the surface had to be thrashed for hours with wooden poles by men standing waist deep in vats. Here is an East Bengal indigo factory with the watermill at the end for the crushing and for the filtration process. And then here is another East Bengal factory, and here we get the benighted ryots standing there with their poles under the supervision of the factory owner. Now, for those of you with a chemical bent, hands up. Good, okay. That is what is going on, as you will probably know already. So here we've got the original leaf, goes through this fermentation process, converts it into that formula, and then when it's oxidized, the air thrashing into it, and here we get the indigo plant, and I'll ask questions about that at the end. But the effort was worth it. By the 1840s, the finished product, when sold to the dye merchants in London and Amsterdam, was, on a weight-for-weight basis, more valuable than gold. And indigo represented more than 50% of the value of all cargoes shipped by the East India Company out of Calcutta. And the kings of the industry were the Savis and the Hill, and James Hills, who owned a total of 11 indigo factories, employing at one stage no less than 60,000 ryots, growing the crop and processing it. A total of 28,000 acres was involved. James and Charlotte Hills had 11 children, 10 of whom survived into adulthood. Gosh, they must have had tough genes. The boys being sent back to England to be educated mainly at military schools like Addiscombe, and now the 5 eldest boys. Meanwhile, James Hills built an imposing Palladian-style mansion at Neechindapur on the banks of the river, and there he and his wife led an idyllic life of hunting, pig-sticking, and entertaining their neighbouring indigo planters. But in 1850, disaster struck. James's beloved wife, Charlotte, died of rheumatic fever, aged only 37. My great-grandmother, Veronica Harriet Hills, was the second youngest child, and then aged 4½. And she has left us a very poignant description of how she remembers the harrowing event when she wrote a manuscript, so far unpublished, Recollections of her family history, in 1917. She wrote it as follows. My father had gone to Neechindapur on business. He dreamt he sat on the veranda at home with my mother when a big black bird came between them and hid her from him. He got up and called for his palki. Nearing Neechindapur, he met his assistant, Mr. Sibbald, and asked, "All well at home?" "All well," he replied. But Mrs. Hills was not down yesterday. So he arrived to find her on her deathbed. Dr. Archer was sent for from Neechindapur, and I remember leeches were applied. Also the smell of laudanum that I recognised years later. I was, of course, banished from her room most of the time, but I used to hang around watching for a chance to steal in and kiss her. Then on the last day, I was made to go down all by myself to the long dining room, and I was given my favourite dish, minced scallops and rice. And all at once, there was a cry throughout the house, and I heard my mother was dead. Oh, I fancy I was dazed and stupefied. But when I knelt at my aunt's knee to say my evening prayers, and it came to "God bless Mama," the floods came, and my aunt, who loved my mother as everyone did, soothed me and put me to bed. But not to sleep. I knew too well what those hammering strokes meant, and in the morning they took her away. Soon afterwards, James Hills commissioned this portrait of his children on the steps of Neechindapur, all dressed in mourning, though my great-great-grandmother, who was always the naughty one, seems to be trying to lighten the somber mood. In this short talk, I can't really go into any details of their very varied and interesting lives. Archibald, the eldest son, also became a famous indigo planter and wrote a book about pig sticking, which is still the Bible of the sport. Two other brothers, John and George, went into the army and achieved high rank in the engineers. Of the daughters, Elizabeth, Lizzie Hills, and Charlotte Tottie Hills both married army officers, and we will return to Tottie Hills' husband, Lieutenant William George Cubitt, shortly. The youngest son, Charlie Hills, was frankly a bit of a card. Very good dancer, favourite with the ladies, though he never in fact married. He had a career in business and lived in lodgings in Calcutta, where his housekeeper was an Anglo-Indian widow by the name of Mrs. O'Brien, who subsequently had a daughter called Maureen. Some years later, Mrs. O'Brien took her daughter to London, where she changed her name to Merle Oberon, and the rest is history. Note the uncanny similarities in the shape of the eyes and the forehead. Anyway, that's another story. Sorry. Now, my great-great-grandmother, Veronica Harriet Hills, grew up and married a rising young Welsh barrister by the name of Lewis Pugh Evans. The wedding took place in Calcutta Cathedral on March the 28th, 1864, when she was 19 and he was 27. In her manuscript, she describes how the wedding was not the grand affair that might have been expected. Her wedding dress was a simple affair of cotton muslin run up by her jersey. The truth was that her father, James Hills, had suffered a succession of financial disasters. In 1854, at the height of the indigo boom, he had not been happy with the price offered by the indigo brokers in Calcutta. So he decided to hire his own argosy and entrust his entire year's production to one ship, to a single ship bound for London. Nor did he like the rates of insurance that were being offered in Calcutta. So when the ship was wrecked in a hurricane, he lost everything again. But he bounced back, restored his fortune, only to be caught up in the Indigo riots of 1861. And this time, the cause was indirectly, as the German chemists have synthesized the chemical process, which you now know all about, and they found a way to make aniline dyes in the laboratory. The word is derived from the Arabic word for indigo, anin. The price of natural indigo plunged, and the farmers who grew the crop as subcontractors to the factories went on the rampage. Many indigo planters were killed, and James Hills was quite lucky to escape with his life. He returned to England, heavily indebted to a man called Elliot MacNaughton, who was also the money lender to the young Prince of Wales, later Edward VII. And James Hills died in 1872 and is buried in the family vault at Kensal Green. But now back to his children. His youngest daughter, Amelia Emmy Hills, married Lewis Evans's brother, Griffith Evans, another barrister. Both the brothers had distinguished careers at the Calcutta Bar, and both were on the Viceroy's advisory panel. My great-grandfather, Lewis Pugh Evans, did spend a considerable time back home in Wales and was elected as the Liberal MP for Cardiganshire in 1880. Having rather confusingly changed his name to Lewis Evans Lewis Pugh Evans Pugh, that's right. Having inherited a lead mining fortune from his uncle, Lewis Pugh of Abermaid, on condition he changed his name. But that's another story. Now we go back to James Hills' second son, Jimmy Hills, who was born in 1833. That is Jimmy Hills at the back there, and this is one of his brother officers, Bobbs Roberts. I don't know who the fat man is. Any help? Anybody recognise him? Very pleased to know. Jimmy Hills was commissioned into the Bengal Horse Artillery and found himself as part of the Army Corps camped outside Delhi at the time of the mutiny in 1857. On July the 9th, the position was guarded by a picket from the 9th Irregular Cavalry, and the guns themselves were supposedly protected by a troop of about 32 cavalry from the Carabineers. The action is best described by Jimmy Hills himself in a letter to one of his brothers. The alarm went, and off I started my two guns to a position laid down for them, when, to my astonishment, through an opening on the right, only 50 yards off, dashed a body of cavalry. Now I tried to get my guns into action, but only got one unlimbered when they were upon me. I thought that by charging them, I might make a commotion and give the gun time to load. So I went at the front rank, cut down the first fellow, slashed the next across the face as hard as I could, when two Sawars charged me. Both their horses crashed into mine at the same moment, and of course both horse and myself were sent flying. We went down at such a pace that I escaped the cuts made at me, one of them giving my jacket an awful slice just below the left arm. It only, however, cut the jacket. Well, I lay quite snug until all had passed over me, and then got up and looked about for my sword. I found it a full 10 yards off, I'd hardly got hold of it when 3 fellows returned, 2 on horseback. The first I wounded, dropped him from his horse. The second charged me with his lance. I put it aside, caught him an awful gash on the face and head. I thought I'd killed him, but apparently he must have clung onto his horse and he disappeared. The wounded man then came up, but got his skull split. Then came on the third man, a young active fellow. I found myself getting very weak from want of breath, the fall from my horse having pumped me considerably, and my cloak had somehow or other got tightly fixed round my throat and was kindly throttling me. I went, however, at the fellow and cut him on the shoulder, but some cloth on it apparently turned the blow. He managed to seize the hilt of my sword and twisted it out of my hand. Then we had a hand-to-hand fight, I punching his head with my fists and he trying to cut me, but I was too close to him. Somehow or other, I fell. Then was the time, fortunately for me, Tombs came up and shot the fellow. When I got up, Tombs was so eager to get up onto the mound near us that I only picked up my sword and followed him. After being there some time, we came down to look after the unlimbered gun which was left behind. When we got down, I saw the very fellow that Tombs had saved me from going off with my pistol. I told Tombs, and we went at him. After a little slashing and guarding at both sides, I rushed at him and thrust. He cleverly jumped aside and cut me on the head, knocking me down. Not, however, stunning me, for I warded his next cut when down. Tombs, following it up, bade him a pass, and up I jumped and had a slash at him, cutting him on the left wrist and nearly severing it. This made him turn round, and Tombs ran him through. Very nearly knocked Tombs over. We cut through his cap and pagri, but fortunately did not even cut the skin. I fancy I am indebted to Tombs for saving my life. For this action, Jimmy Hills was awarded the Victoria Cross. Major, later Sir Henry Tombs, was also awarded the VC for his part in what a brother officer described as this noble action, later referred to by Sir Henry Cotton as one of the most striking exploits at the siege of Delhi. In fact, this was not the first VC awarded to a member of the family, since Lieutenant William George Cubitt of the 13th Native Bengal Infantry, Totty Hills' husband, had won the medal in January that year. I quote from Valour and Sacrifice, famous regiments of the Indian Army by Lieutenant Colonel Gautam Sharma. After their victory at Kanpur, the sepoys, who had raised the standard of revolt, were advancing on Lucknow under Peshwa Nana Sahib. Sir Henry Lawrence was informed that the number of the advancing column was insignificant. He therefore ventured forth and met the Indian column at Chinhat. Here he found that the force was about 20,000 strong, supported by at least 6 or 7 field batteries. As it was not advisable to confront such a large force, he decided to withdraw. It was during the retreat of the English force on January the 30th, 1857, that Lieutenant William George Cubitt was awarded the VC for saving the lives of 3 men of the 32nd Regiment at risk to his own. And there we have him with getting these 3 soldiers back. Jimmy Hills rose to become a general, commanding a division in the Second Afghan War and was knighted for his services. When his lifelong friend, General Bobbs Roberts, was sent out to South Africa to rescue the Army's reputation in the Boer War, Jimmy Hills came out of retirement to be at his side as an unofficial advisor. Late in life, Jimmy Hills had married the daughter of Judge Johns of Dollicothy in Cardiganshire, who had been murdered by his Irish butler That's another cracking and changed his name, like so many of these Welsh people, the confusion of genealogists, has changed his name to Hills Johns, which is the name recorded in the annals of the Victoria Cross. You won't find him under James Hills, you won't look up under Hills Johns. Bobbs Roberts was a frequent visitor at Dollicothy, and here is a picture of the two old codgers outside the house just before World War I. The reputation for outstanding valour extended to the next generation as well. My great-great-aunt Emmy Hills, who married the second Evans brother, as you will all remember, Griffith Evans, they had a son called Lewis Pugh Evans, who was a colonel in the Black Watch in 1917. Now, the Lincolnshire Regiment, the officer corps, had been absolutely decimated in the lead up to the campaign of 1917. And so Lewis Evans, Colonel Lewis Evans, was asked to take command of the 1st Lincolnshires. And he believed very much in leading from the front. So at the Battle of Passchendaele, when the whistle blew, he was the first over the top. He took his first company forward. They actually managed to reach their objective, then got held up, so he told them to rest, and he then personally led the second company forward in towards the enemy trench lines. They got held up by an enemy machine gun post. So Colonel Lewis Evans said to his sergeant, "You go down that way and try and do a right flanking movement, and I will cause a diversion, attract the gunner's attention." And by this it meant that he stood up, waved his arms, and ran absolutely straight at this machine gun post. He caught a bullet in the shoulder, but when his sergeant and the troops arrived on the scene, there were 2 German machine gunners with their hands up, and Colonel Lewis Evans standing over them with his revolver. He refused to go and have it dressed until he had made his report back to headquarters, where the general gave him the most frightful and said, "I think I ought to court-martial you. You're a colonel, not a wild second lieutenant sort of seeking glory." Anyway, they forgot about the court-martial and gave him the VC instead. This leads me convinced. Oh, wait a minute. And here I have. There is Colonel Lewis Evans. And here he is much later in life. On the left here, when he was Lord Lieutenant of Cardiganshire, with his nephew, Colonel or General then, Lewis Pugh. And all the names are the same. It's wildly confusing. This is Lewis Owain Pugh. This leads me conveniently to the last truly valiant military action by a member of the family, which took place during World War II, and it brings us back to India. Lewis Owain Pugh, great-grandson of James Hills, and my first cousin once removed, was a young colonel working for SOE, the Special Operations Executive. He recruited a team of elderly volunteers from the Calcutta Light Horse Regiment, then a drinking club for retired reservists. They stole a dredging barge from the Hooghly, sailed it all the way round via Ceylon to Goa, where they proceeded to blow up and sink 3 German ships that had taken refuge there. And every single member of the party survived and returned to their, rather knocked about, to their bemused families who thought they'd gone on a week's gentle camp. Since Portuguese Goa was neutral territory, there could be no medals, and the whole extraordinary escapade was kept secret until the 1960s, when Rank Brothers made a swashbuckling film about it called The Sea Wolves, starring David Niven, Trevor Howard, and Roger Moore, with the role of the 37-year-old Lewis Pugh, played by 64-year-old Gregory Peck. The film is frequently repeated on Saturday afternoon television. It's stunking good, and I can't but that is another story. I see my cousin Charles is taking some notes and probably got some corrections to make. What did I get wrong? What did I get wrong?
Well, my uncle Bernard Davies, who commanded the tramp steamer that went round the south of India with the Calcutta Light Horse on board.
Oh, really?
He's naval advisor to that film.
There, you see? I
wonder if you'd like to repeat that.
I wasn't making it up here.
I'm sorry, we didn't hear that.
Me too. I just said that my uncle Bernard Davies commanded the tramp steamer that took the Calcutta Light Horse round the south of India.
Wasn't a tramp steamer?
Well,
it was a barge.
Wasn't it? Anyway, well, actually, had a
barge.
well, I don't know, but his brother has family stories. But anyway, he was naval advisor to the film, and said that the film got it badly wrong as well. I'm not saying that I was badly wrong. I'm going into deep water here, but now you forgive me, I'm sure, because we're both family historians in different ways.
That's the problem with having families, you have arguments all the time. Well, after that rousing speech, I wonder if you'd be good enough to answer a few questions. Has anybody got any questions? Yes,
Miles, how long did your involvement with Indigo actually carry on?
how long did the family's involvement with Indigo actually continue?
Yes. Well, here we have Mother whose ancestor was the 1190s speaking. Yes. So when did the Indigo part of it stop?
Oh, by the 1880s, it was really just not worth doing. The method that the indigo planters used was they would give the seed to farmers, to ryots, on the promise that 2 years later they would then buy their crop off them. So the farmers received no income until the final payoff. And then the third year, after the third year, the leaves weren't any good. But one interesting thing is that the Indian version of indigo, Tintoria, I've forgotten his name, takes the nitrogen, which is an essential part of the chemical, takes it out of the air, whereas woad takes it out of the ground. So in Northern Europe, it is growing the crop it diminishes the goodness of soil, whereas if you plowed the old pulp leaves back in again in Bengal, it acted as a fertilizer. So, but of course the people could only be persuaded to grow it if there was going to be a big payoff at the end. And the moment the value fell, it wasn't worth, nobody wanted to grow it. And so they all went over to rice and other more staple things you could eat, rather than indigo. So the indigo business just collapsed. And after James Hill's son, Archibald Hills, and another of their cousins, the Bardens, went on struggling up in the north west of the region that I was showing you on that map, where they had the other branch of the family had, and they struggled on into the 1880s, 1890s, but after that it was hopeless.
Thank you. Yes, Patricia.
How did James Hills make this transition from indigo to the Afghan frontier?
That was Jimmy. It was Jimmy Hills who became the. But when you say your family were indigo.
No, this lady.
Yeah, but the indigo was grown in other parts of India as well. But it was East Bengal that was the big part. But there were lots of other producers all the way up the Ganges Valley.
And also over the bit that I know on the southwest, that was also, there was indigo all over the Nilgiri Hills.
There was, yes. Yes, and they all suffered the same fate. The moment the Germans, bless them, decided you could make it in a test tube rather than having to go through this delightful, romantic process, and absolutely stuffed it.
Yes, this gentleman here.
Well, my great-grandfather was an indigo planter, but he was in the Gazipur district in Bihar.
Oh yes, and they still grow it in Bihar now.
Yes, and his wife's father was an indigo planter in Purnia district, north of Bihar. And that was still going in 1891. And the Indigo Association actually disbanded in 1920. So there was indigo still going on.
And there is still, I believe up in Bihar, they still grow a bit. There was a revival, I think I'm right in saying, that of course the invention of the genes, the American dungaree workload, did give an enormous boost to the indigo demand. And there was a time, I think, in the 1890s, when the Germans just couldn't produce enough. And so the natural stuff did have a slight revival.
I understood that the indigo, synthetic indigo, was discovered during the First World War.
Oh no, much earlier.
Much earlier.
Oh yes, 1857 was the first. Was the first synthesis. Yeah.
But not production.
Oh yes, I mean, I think they built up production from them, and through the 1860s was when the price really absolutely collapsed.
George, you
mentioned Bob Roberts, the Indigo Marshall book.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
in the back.
Indigo is still grown. I've been seeing the process in Gujarat and around the Calico Museum, and it's a lot of it is used for medical reasons now.
Is it?
Yes. They've discovered that it's good, and the Japanese grows a lot still, and the Chinese.
And I think Sumatra too. There's quite a lot, but nothing like the scale.
Not the huge production that used to be, but it is being brought again, and in France as well. They're growing it again. You can buy clothes dyed in real indigo in Toulouse.
I wonder. There was a thing in my youth that used to get put on the pustules that used to burst out on my neck called injection bar. But you didn't have pustules. Do you think that indigo was involved in gentian violet?
I've seen no idea. I went with Jenny Bell from Paul.
Something else.
Oh, she is, I mean, you will have recognised many of the illustrations I poached out of her wonderful book.
I went with her when she was researching it.
Oh, right. Oh, so some of the photographs you probably took.
I did take them, they're not those ones, no.
This is the most wonderful book by Jenny Balfour, Balfour Paul, published by the British Museum about 10 years ago.
Felt that, yes.
Yes. And I have to say that I've cribbed all my knowledge I know of indigo from this, and I'm extremely indebted to you.
Yes, Denise.
Is the house that you showed us a picture of on the banks of the river still there?
Is the house still there that you showed a picture of?
My cousin, Charles, wake up. Might need your assistance on here. Phillida Ormond, as she was, and she was descendant of one of the other parts of the Hills family. She married a man called Peter Moles, and they went out to that region in 1987. And stupidly, and they brought back a wonderful photograph. The portico is still there. The rest of it is in ruins. And it was being squatted in by how many families?
I don't know.
Did it say?
It was almost impossible to get to. They had a very difficult journey to get there on the public road, so we're non-existent virtually.
And they got terribly lost. They got misdirected, didn't they,
Yes.
twice?
No,
But, so, in 1987, the great portico pillars were still there.
One interesting thing is they built a chapel for Protestants and a chapel for Catholics, I believe. Yes.
And she went to see my great-great-great-grandmother's grave, the poor, delicious Charlotte Savvy, the young bride, and who my great-great-grandfather used to go to her grave every day when he was out there. And that is still there, but very, very overgrown. So, if you like to make a trip there, please let me know if the portico is still up.
Yes,
We had to ask when the book is going to be published, didn't we?
Is the book going to be published?
Yes.
Well, it's over to you.
Miles was asked if we FIBIS would consider publishing it. We'll consider it, of course. Well, I'd like to bring this session to a close, if I may, and ask you to express your appreciation for a truly wonderful talk.